The 1829 Tour of Scotland. A journey none of us can be forgetting. Forged in art and music, Scotland is breathing much life into the young Mendelssohn Bartholdy. My name is Karl Klingermann, and with my good friend Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, we are just completing a most wonderful trip across Scotland. Oh, the beauty and majesty of these isles is something to behold.
He absolutely loved Scotland. I think Scotland was considered, certainly in Germany, and this may sound very strange nowadays, rather a wild place. Things haven't changed that much, I don't think, as far as that's concerned, you know.
Prior to Scott writing about it, this was a savage place. We were on the top end of Europe. Even the Romans couldn't conquer us, remember. Nobody came here.
And the poet Johann Wolfgang Goethe suggested that it might be an idea for him to travel north to the area beyond the Roman civilization, beyond Hadrian's Wall.
A lot of people wonder why we've ended up with so much Mendelssohn material is because one of his grandsons ended up teaching at the university. We have basically the main sketchbook that Mendelssohn took with him on his tour of Scotland. This one here is the one he would have got out to sketch, and Mendelssohn would have carried in his pocket this delightful little pocketbook, a gift from his brother-in-law, and in it he made some little sketches. He also made notes of people's addresses, people he was visiting in London, also some musical sketches, ideas that he had. Most of Mendelssohn's completed music manuscripts were given to the Royal Library in Berlin by Mendelssohn's children back in the 1870s. What we have here is the autograph score of the Hebrides Overture, which of course was inspired by his visit to Scotland.
Mendelssohn was a 20-year-old young man on a gap year jaunt. His father wanted him to go into banking and his mother to be an artist of some sort. He was on a journey of discovery. A lot of young German men did this sort of thing. They would go off on travels to become adult men, learn about life on their own, away from the family ties. And so, in that sense, he was expecting a broad education, yeah.
His quite domineering parents decided that rather than send him to Italy or France, Felix's grand tour would start in Scotland. And there were 2 or 3 reasons for this. A couple of the reasons were literary, the first being that Mendelssohn and his whole family were avid readers of Sir Walter Scott, who was all the rage in Europe at the time. In fact, there was a thing called Scottomania, and every artist and intellectual read the novels. And we know from his library that he read the novels of Walter Scott in English, which is quite an achievement. I think people today, even English speakers, find it difficult to get through a Walter Scott novel. The other reason, they were very keen readers of the 3rd century Scottish bard Ossian, and they hadn't realised in 1829 that Ossian was a complete fabrication of the 18th century Scottish writer James Macpherson. So all of these wonderful supposed 3rd century epic poems, which included the story of Fingal, were in fact the invention of this 18th century Scottish writer.
Whilst many explore to the south of Europe, we believe that in the far north, Felix will be finding much to galvanize his art and his music. In London, I am working for the Hanoverian government, where Felix is first joining me. I need to keep a close eye on him, as he's becoming quite a recognizable figure amongst the well-read peoples of society. After many days of fun in London, we are heading north to York, then Durham, before arriving in Edinburgh.
When he left London with Klingermann by stagecoach on the 23rd of July, they must have felt a huge relief because Menelssohn himself had been the focus of attention and he could just enjoy himself without composing and conducting and performing pressures. He says in a letter home, "We won't forget it as long as we live," and he felt that he was free for probably one of the few times in his life.
Our hearts, our eyes, and all our other senses are anticipating this adventure with great relish.
Klingermann was a very trusted friend, and in fact Felix later in his life described Klingermann as his best friend, as close as you can get.
Now you want my full name? It's Cecile Helen Enold Talma Steyman Mendelssohn Bartholdy. I am the great-granddaughter of the composer Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy. Apart from being a musician, he did do some painting, watercolours, and the one that I like best is his study in Leipzig. His study looks very much like the painting, with the big oven on the left-hand side, his desk on the right, and then you look through to the window, and it's very, very nice. And my parents always had it somewhere in their drawing room, and I like it very much.
Walking through the Palace of Holyrood and striding amongst the ruins of the Abbey, young Felix realizes the beginning of what he is calling his Scottish Symphony. He is so excited by this that it is a wonder to see. I witness him saying, "I believe I have found, today in that old chapel, the beginning of my Scottish Symphony."
The Scottish Symphony, as it's called, inspired by the rather sort of bleakness of the Abbey. That gives a very sort of sombre and sobering aspect to the music.
We knew we must experience all that Scotland has to offer, and this includes the cold yet refreshing sea water to the north of the city. In the coastal town of Portobello, we endure the northern breezes and icy currents of the Forth estuary. This is most refreshing and exhilarating. The Scottish Ocean is very briny. Doberan is lemonade compared to this.
His mother was very keen on the writer Sir Walter Scott. She said to him, "Don't come back to Germany without visiting Sir Walter Scott."
Before our adventure north, we are taking a carriage south to the town of Melrose to visit this magnificent man at his home they call Abbotsford House.
In 1826, Scott had his financial collapse. He lost everything. He lost his house in Edinburgh, technically lost Abbotsford, but was given a kind of a life rent in return for trying to write his way out of debt. So when Mendelssohn came in 1829, that's the situation that Scott was in, which actually may explain why Mendelssohn didn't get a very happy visit because of the pressure Scott was under. And he stopped writing his journal just a few days before Mendelssohn arrived. And he didn't start it until May the following year. And he said, the reason I stopped it was I was gloomy and I didn't want to write gloomy things. I don't think they made it into the house. We're told that Scott was on the point of leaving and they were only here for 30 minutes. Somebody once said Scott was pruning his roses. I don't know where that story came from, but anyway, I imagine they just met in the garden. Scott was a bit grumpy and a bit offhand. And I mean, a 20-year-old is not going to pick up, here is this man, this towering figure that he's been expecting to meet, actually is now showing signs of decline. We don't read Walter Scott as we once did, but we can almost hear his words in Mendelssohn's music. Mendelssohn wouldn't have written Hebridean music, he wouldn't have written Scottish symphonies, but for the words of Walter Scott.
The story's gone down in history for them as a bit of an adventure and an amusing side to Sir Walter Scott's character that we don't usually see.
There's a famous letter, joint letter, that Klingermann and Mendelssohn wrote home after they had tried to visit Sir Walter Scott in Abbotsford. And Klingermann goes on for a couple of pages in a fantasy about how successful the visit to Sir Walter Scott had been and how they'd met the great man and how they'd stayed under his roof at Abbotsford and how Walter Scott's daughter had made the most delicious marmalade, all of these flights of fancy. And then there's a PS in the letter, and Mendelssohn said, this is all Klingermann's invention. We found Sir Walter in the act of leaving Abbotsford, stared at him like fools, and lost a whole day for the sake of at best 1/2 hour of superficial conversation.
Our travels begin, and we are to take a steamship from Newhaven Harbour in Leith upriver to Stirling.
They actually set off from Newhaven Harbour on the outskirts of Edinburgh on a steamer. It was always steamers in those days, up the Firth of Forth to Stirling, and they would have got a coach across to Perth where they spent the night. And then from Perth it was up to the Highlands and across the Central Highlands past Loch Tay to Fort William. That was a combination of walking and horse and cart. And we also know from the sketches that they experienced the most horrendous weather. After the first couple of days, the weather was okay, but on about the 3rd or 4th of August, it really turned, and they found themselves walking in the absolute pouring rain.
We are visiting Burnham Wood, and this is very mystical to us, and Felix demands he sketch the countryside, or it will be forgotten. The Hermitage and Falls of Bran are full of such wild beauty that the sound of the furious rushing water is giving both Felix and I time to reflect. Felix is insisting on exploring further upriver. It is here that we come across the Rumbling Bridge. A wonder of architecture and engineering as it fords the raging waters of this river. We are heading north by carriage for a night in Blair Athol, where the horses will rest. The Bridge of Tilt Hotel is very welcoming to us this night.
It's quite clear that Mendelssohn and Klingermann had a strong grasp of Scottish history, and we know this because when they stopped at the pass of Killiecrankie, Klingermann wrote a poem which was interspersed between the leaves of Mendelssohn's sketches. It's a 3-stanza poem, and the first stanza is preceded by a date, which is 1689, and it goes, 1689, in the pass of Killiecrankie chanced a bloody bladed fight, twixt the Scots and raiding English, who were beat and put to flight, for all a day of torment. 1745, in the pass of Killiecrankie, scores of Highland braves did rest, dreams to crown the young pretender, which did prove too great a test, for all a day of torment. 1829, at the pass of Killiecrankie, travellers too did pause to rest, staring up to clouds of thunder for both a day of torment.
Young Felix is looking like he is hypnotized by the rushing waters. Our carriage is once again ready and we make our way west to Aberfeldy. At every opportunity, Felix and I exercise our aching legs from the cramped carriage. Loch Tummel is a most beautiful body of water with such an elegant bridge where we are crossing. In Aberfeldy, we are understanding that the Scottish bard, Rabbi Burns, visited the falls of Moness. Felix insists, like a demanding child, we must see these enchanted waters. We resume our adventure along the banks of Loch Tay. So arduous is this part of the ride that we stop many times. Felix sketches more, anything to take his mind off this most uncomfortable of journeys. Little words will be required back home, as his pictures are portraying our journey so well. We spend time resting as our carriage takes us on into the wilds of the Highlands. Overshadowing us is the mountain Ben More. Now it is these mountains telling us tales of their great history and past. We head north to Fort William, where we are to meet with a paddle steamer that will take us down into Oban.
They knew that they had to get to Fort William on the evening of the 6th of August because every Friday at that time there was a steamer that went from Fort William all the way down Loch Linney to Oban, and they were well enough informed to know that they had to get to Fort William to catch that steamer.
All around us, in every direction, are mountains shrouded in mist. Felix is transfixed with Donnelly Castle at the entrance to Oban Harbour. We walk into the hills to find a point from which Felix may observe and sketch this pleasurable sight. As he stared across the sea to Mull, he begins to write music with what he is observing. These opening bars he is to call the Lonely Isle.
Inspired by the sight of the islands off the west coast of Scotland, the Hebrides, from the mainland, he penned a few bars that suggest this sort of misty, promising, rather mysterious outlook to the west. And these bars he wrote down and sent to his sister, who kept them, and eventually when he got back to Germany he turned that into what we know as Fingal's Cave, a Hebrides overture.
There's a wonderful misunderstanding in music history that everyone thinks that Mendelssohn went to Fingal's Cave and was so inspired by Fingal's Cave that he wrote down what eventually became the Hebrides Overture. But in fact, the night before he ever set eyes on the cave, he actually wrote a letter home and quoted the first 16 or so bars of what eventually became the Hebrides Overture.
Our boarding house is very close to the harbour and all that is going on in this beautiful community. The tone on these buildings is like one of Felix's painting palettes, an abundance of colour. We both agree to endure a further voyage to see the infamous caves on the Isle of Staffa, which many have written about, including Sir Walter Scott, who had so little time for us.
The question of why Felix Mendelssohn and Karl Klingermann visited the island of Staffa and Fingal's Cave, I think there are two answers. One is that they'd read all the poems of Ossian, and one of those poems featured the history of Fingal. And of course, Fingal's Cave is supposed to be where the giant Fingal lived. And the other is very prosaic in that they had a very detailed map with instructions about where they should visit. And this was unusual for those days. It's a bit like the equivalent of a rough guide or a blue guide these days. And Fingal's Cave was certainly in that map book that they took with them on this Scottish journey.
The swell of the sea is not good to either crew or passenger. Felix is spending his time lying ill at the bottom of the boat. Perhaps he is thinking of the trip back. Felix is mesmerized by the acoustic effect of Fingal's Cave. The basalt pillars are reminding us both of the pipes from a huge organ. It is unbelievable how nature is creating such spectacular beauty as this. The sea sound accompanies us in a harmonic chorus of crashes and swirling splashes. The journey back to the mainland of Mull is as torturous as the voyage out and best left unsaid. We are so enjoying the hospitality afforded us by the folk of Tobermory, and this is nothing short of inspirational to my writing and to Felix's art and composition. I think the greatest compliment and accolade of all to any composer is to hear their music being played by others.
I only heard the octet, Mendelssohn's octet, which he wrote when he was 16. I was fascinated by that because I thought, 16 to be able to compose that, that's really quite something.
Well, I've been involved since the very beginning, which was 30 years ago, and it was an idea of Leonard Friedman's. And Leonard had been working with students. He was worried that they were terribly hot-housed. They were technically very, very good, that they perhaps lacked what in a jazz world would be called soul. Being on stage and performing is the learning exercise, and it's really that they learn from their fellow players and from fellow professionals.
He's a performer. He probably needs to be one of the kind of great sort of singer-songwriters. I think he's probably Prince, actually. Prince's first album, that he recorded all of it himself. I think I'm right, or possibly it's only a few of the songs, but he played something like 17 instruments, and I always think that that's kind of maybe what Mendelssohn could have done. I mean, he was understood to be an astonishing pianist and organist, and he's one of the first of what in modern days we call a conductor. One of the first people to stand in front of an orchestra and impose their view. So people had enormous respect for him.
This then is the end of our Highland journey and the last of our joint letters.
A genius in the way that we use the word, in the sense that he was supremely gifted, extremely intelligent and well trained, and in many ways he used his skills to create an art that is instantly appealing on every level, and he's a joy to perform.